On January 31st, 2018, the Republic of Nauru celebrated 50 years of independence. To mark the occasion, there was singing, dancing, a beauty pageant, and a speech by the then president of the tiny island republic, His Excellency Baron Waka. So far, so normal, except perhaps for the beauty pageant. But in the opening of President Waka's speech, there was one really weird thing. Well, two things actually. He started off by welcoming the many foreign dignitaries attending the event, including the Governor-General of Australia, 7 prime ministers and presidents from other Pacific Island nations, ministers from New Zealand, Indonesia, and Palau, and an official envoy from Japan. Again, so far so normal. But then President Waka welcomed the foreign ministers from the Republic of Abkhazia and the Republic of South Ossetia, 2 countries that, according to most of the world at least, don't actually exist. Hi, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and welcome to another edition of Strange Politics. This video is about the often bizarre foreign policy of the Republic of Nauru, a tiny island nation with just over 10,000 citizens. Do you know what else has a very low population? My subscriber count. So before we go any further, take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe to my future videos, and hit the bell so you will be sure to see them. Now, if the YouTube algorithm is doing its job, most people watching this video will have already seen other videos about Nauru, because there are a lot of them. These videos tend to focus on Nauru being a very small country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the 3rd smallest in the world by population, located just 1 degree latitude south of the equator. Nauru becoming an extraordinarily wealthy country in the 70s and 80s by strip mining its soil for phosphate, and in the process destroying most of its 8 square miles of land. And the Nauru government squandering this enormous wealth through a series of bad, often corrupt investments, including the backing of a failed London West End musical based on the life of Leonardo da Vinci. Nauru is now one of the poorest countries in the world. But the one thing which rarely gets discussed on any videos, or anywhere for that matter, is Nauru's really strange foreign policy. And perhaps the weirdest part of its foreign policy is its extensive diplomatic relations with 2 Russian-backed breakaway republics, both located inside the borders of Georgia, the former Soviet republic in the Caucasus, not the American state, and which are known as Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Like Nauru, these 2 countries are poor, and also very small, not nearly as small as teeny-tiny Nauru, but much smaller than average. If they were ranked alongside the rest of the world's independent nations by population, South Ossetia would be 9th smallest in the world with 53,000 people, and Abkhazia would be 23rd smallest with 245,000 people. But Abkhazia and South Ossetia are not usually ranked alongside the rest of the world's independent nations for anything, as very few countries in the world consider them to be legitimate, and for good reason. Both countries declared their independence from Georgia in the early 90s, at roughly the same time that Georgia declared its independence from the old Soviet Union. Georgia was one of the 15 republics which made up the Soviet Union, and when it fell apart at the end of 1991, all 15 of these republics, from gigantic Russia to tiny Tajikistan, were quickly recognized by the United Nations and the rest of the diplomatic establishment as legit new countries. Several smaller pieces of the 15 Soviet republics tried to claim independence too, but these were not recognized by the UN or pretty much anyone, and since Abkhazia and South Ossetia were parts of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, they were out of luck. But despite the lack of international acknowledgement, these 2 sort of countries managed to keep the Georgian government out of their respective territories, more or less, for many years, with help from Russia, who have never been big fans of Georgia being an independent country in the first place. And for a long time, not much else happened. No one recognized Abkhazia or South Ossetia as legitimate, not even Russia, although the 2 finally did get round to recognizing each other, finally, in 2005. In 2008, largely because of the continued existence of these breakaway countries, Russia and Georgia ended up going to war. The war didn't change the borders, but after it was over, Russia decided to at least recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia, to much rejoicing, and began trying to get the rest of the world to do the same. Initially, only 3 countries followed Russia's lead: Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Nauru. The idea that Nicaragua and Venezuela, two small to medium-sized Latin American countries, would get involved with Russian-backed breakaway republics is pretty weird. But the idea that tiny Nauru, 8,000 miles away and with all of Asia and half the Pacific Ocean between them, would want to strike up a friendship with these two countries is even weirder. There are no historic, cultural, or economic ties between these countries at all, not even close. But despite there being no obvious benefit, Nauru made it official in 2009 and has really pulled out the stops when it comes to deepening its relations with these partially recognized countries, especially in its dealings with Abkhazia. For example, in August 2011, 2 years after recognizing it as a legitimate country, tiny, impoverished Nauru sent a delegation of government bigwigs, including former President Scotty Ludwig, 8,000 miles west to Abkhazia, to act as official observers for the Abkhazian presidential election. That might sound bizarre, but this was only the start. A year later, in September 2012, the then president of Nauru, Sprent Dabwido, met with the Abkhaz ambassador to Russia, Igor Akba, during a visit to Moscow. Then 2 years after that, in August 2014, former President Scotty Ludwig returned to Abkhazia. This time, he was awarded the coveted Order Chesim I Slava, or in English, the Order of Honor and Glory, second degree. According to media reports, Ludwig got the award for his contribution to the strengthening of friendship between the peoples of the Republic of Abkhazia and the Republic of Nauru. There is a higher third-degree version of this award, though, so it's not really as impressive as it sounds. In April 2015, the finance minister of Nauru, David Adang, visited Abkhazia, where he was quoted as saying, "Our countries should become closer, and our relations should become stronger." To do this, Adang suggested Abkhazia appoint an official representative in Nauru, and that Nauru could represent Abkhazian interests at the Inter-Parliamentary Union and at the Pacific Islands Forum, which I'm sure would be massively helpful. In 2016, the Speaker of Nauru's parliament, Cyril Buraman, stopped by the Abkhaz capital of Sukhumi to sign a treaty of friendship and cooperation. Then in November 2017, the biggest delegation from Nauru yet arrived in Abkhazia. This group included the current president of Nauru, Baron Waka, who thus became only the second head of state to visit the breakaway republic after Vladimir Putin. It also included Nauru's ambassador to the United Nations, Marlene Moses, who presumably must have flown in from New York, and several more bored-looking people who spent a lot of time looking at their phones. The delegation met with the Abkhaz president Raul Kajimba, and President Waka got a cool new coat. There is a lot that is weird about these nearly annual visits to Abkhazia from Nauruan officials, but from a cost point of view alone, the whole thing seems insane. Flying a delegation from Nauru to the Caucasus Mountains must cost tens of thousands of dollars each time, possibly more. You've got to wonder how they pay for it, let alone justify the cost to the citizens of Nauru. The Nauru government is basically broke, its economy is shot, and over 90% of the country is either unemployed or working for the government. Neither Nauru nor Abkhazia can afford any of this, actually, and, as an Abkhaz diplomat once admitted, they can't even afford to fix the toilets in their foreign office building. No, the money making all of these visits possible is almost certainly coming from Russia. Russia denies that they are bankrolling Abkhazia's foreign relations, but when Nauru first recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2009, there were reports in the Russian media that Nauru received $50 million in development grants as part of the deal. Russian officials at the time denied that this was a direct exchange, money for diplomatic relations, but even a former Abkhaz foreign minister has confessed that the entire international practice is sheer bargaining to a certain extent. But a one-off aid package in 2009, even a $50 million one, doesn't explain why the Nauru government keeps up its nearly annual visits to Abkhazia, and why it is so keen to do things like represent Abkhazia in the Pacific Islands Forum. No one knows for sure, but it is at least possible that Nauru has remained so keen because the money from Russia continues to flow. At least, when it comes to Nauru, there is a precedent. For many decades, the Republic of China, better known as Taiwan, offered bribes to small countries in the Pacific, the Caribbean, and Central America in the form of development aid in exchange for recognition of the Taiwanese government as the legitimate government of all of China. This was a pure vanity project for Taiwan. No one really cares which government Belize or the Marshall Islands think should be considered the real China. But the money was good. Sometimes the Beijing-based People's Republic of China, which is the government most countries recognize as the real China, would counter with their own bribe, international aid package. The government of Nauru got very good at playing the two Chinas against each other and switched their recognition from one to the other for more and more money. But not only development aid was involved. In the 2011 leak of confidential U.S. diplomatic cables from WikiLeaks, it was revealed that the Taiwanese government had been paying each and every Nauruan minister $5,000 per month just to keep them happy with their continued recognition of Taiwan. In recent years, Taiwan has scaled back on this checkbook diplomacy, as it is known, but it still provides support to Nauru, and it remains one of only two countries, along with Australia, to maintain a physical embassy in Nauru. There's no evidence that the Russian government has been providing any money to Nauruan officials in the same way Taiwan did, but the Nauru government does appear unusually enthusiastic about its ties with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. If this bizarre bit of diplomacy is being funded by the Russian government, it still begs an even bigger question. Why bother? Nauru is tiny, broke, and has very little clout on the international stage. But don't forget, Nauru is a fully fledged member of the United Nations. It's not much, but this does mean if you're an unrecognized breakaway republic, or want to promote the interests of one, having international recognition from Nauru at least means something. Nauru has also helped Russia by withdrawing recognition from another breakaway government, one it doesn't like, Kosovo. Kosovo was part of Serbia until it unilaterally declared independence in 2008. About half the world's countries, including the United States, have since recognized Kosovo, but Nauru dropped out of this group in November 2019. This made Serbia, a close ally of Russia, very happy. Regular visits by Nauruan delegations also provide a useful annual dose of propaganda for the Abkhaz media, as official foreign visits are pretty thin on the ground in Sukhumi. Speaking about the 2017 visits, one Abkhaz dissident said it was an excuse for Abkhaz television to gleefully discuss the international visit for several weeks. The same dissident noted that Abkhaz researchers searched and found common ground in the cultures and languages of the two peoples, as a pretense to make the Nauru visit seem less nonsensical. But perhaps the biggest reason Russia seems willing to keep funding Nauru-Abkhaz relations is a fear of losing face. In 2011, 2 years after Nauru's recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, two more Pacific Island nations did the same, Vanuatu and Tuvalu. For a moment at least, it appeared as if Russia's efforts to get widespread recognition was working, at least among very small countries in the Pacific. But then, in 2014, both Vanuatu and Tuvalu dropped their recognition and formally began diplomatic relations with Georgia. And, while recognition by tiny island nations most people don't even know exist may not mean much, being dropped by tiny island nations most people don't even know exist really stings. So in a strange way, keeping Nauru on side has become even more important over time, especially as the only other country Russia has persuaded to recognize Abkhazia since then is Syria, a country in even more dire straits than Nauru, and also where the Russian military has a substantial presence. So for the 50th anniversary of Nauru's independence, Russia pulled out all the stops and flew South Ossetia's foreign minister, Dmitry Medvedev, and Abkhazia's foreign minister, Daura Kove, 8,000 miles east to one of the most remote corners of the world. Once the festivities were over, the foreign ministers met with their counterparts, exchanged gifts, and signed memorandums of understanding on cooperation and interaction on international relations, plus agreements that would allow nationals of South Ossetia and Abkhazia to travel visa-free to Nauru. Nauru only gets 200 tourists per year in total, and the chance that they will get any visitors from the two countries at all is pretty much zero. But both South Ossetia and Abkhazia got to issue press releases, and that's what really matters.